Clara Whitfield was 34 years old the winter she buried her husband, and discovered, 3 days later, that the farm had never truly been hers to keep. Her brother-in-law, Warren Whitfield, arrived with a lawyer and a deed bearing a signature Clara did not remember her husband making, and by the second week of January, she was standing in the frozen dooryard with 2 carpet bags, $41 sewn into her hem, and a brindle cattle dog named Scout pressed hard against her leg, as though he alone understood what had just been taken from her. She told herself, as the wagon that was no longer hers rattled off down the frozen lane, that a woman who had been left with nothing could still choose what she did with it. And 3 weeks later, in the town of Prairie Bend, Kansas, she spent 11 of her remaining dollars on a padlocked, dust-blind building that no one else in 20 years had wanted at any price. The old Coldwell Printshop, sealed up since the printer himself vanished into the prairie one September night and was never seen again. Everyone told her she had bought a haunted ruin. She did not yet know that behind its silent iron press sat a secret that would clear a dead man's name, humble the richest man in town, and give Prairie Bend back something it had been quietly robbed of for 2 decades. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Whitfield and her faithful dog Scout. If a story like this one has ever reminded you that worth is not always visible at first glance, we would love to hear which part stayed with you longest. Clara had not always been a woman without a roof. She had grown up 11 miles east of Prairie Bend, in a clapboard house that smelled of ink and lamp oil, because her father, Augustus Merriweather, had run the small weekly paper in the town of Elm Crossing until consumption took him in her 20th year. Augustus had been the kind of man who believed a printed page carried a weight that spoken words did not, that ink, once set, could not be talked around or denied the way a rumor could, and he had taught his only daughter to set type before she was 10, standing her on an apple crate so her small hands could reach the California job case, showing her how to read backward and upside down, how to lock a formie so tightly that not one letter would shift in the run. "A press doesn't lie, Clara girl," he used to tell her, tapping the iron frame of his own Washington hand press with 2 ink-stained fingers. "It only tells you exactly what you gave it." The trouble with people is they forget that a thing can be honest, even after everyone around it has gone dishonest. She had loved him for saying things like that, and she had loved the shop itself, the particular hush of a print room before a run, the smell of linseed and lampblack, the way morning light fell through dusty windows onto drawers of type sorted by weight and size, like a small kingdom of tiny soldiers. When Augustus died, the Elm Crossing paper was sold to settle his debts, and 18-year-old Clara went to keep house for an aunt in Prairie Bend, carrying with her only her father's composing stick, a leather apron gone soft with age, and the particular, unglamorous competence of a woman who could read type upside down. It was in Prairie Bend, 2 years later, that she met Thomas Whitfield, a quiet, decent farmer, with sun-cracked hands, and a laugh that came slow, but came all the way, and it was Thomas, who, courting her clumsily at the Grange social, had walked 5 miles in the rain to bring her a stray, half-starved cattle dog pup he'd found shivering under a grain wagon, because she had once mentioned, only once, that she missed having a dog. She named the pup Scout, because he had the look of something always listening for what was coming next, and from that day, the dog was never more than a room away from her. Thomas and Clara married the following spring. They were not wealthy, but they were, for 11 years, steady. A good garden, a milk cow, a marriage built on the unglamorous competence of 2 people who showed up for each other daily. And Scout grew from a knock-kneed pup into a sturdy brindle-coated dog with one ear that never stood quite straight, who slept across the threshold of their bedroom every night of his life as though he had personally appointed himself the last line of the household's defense. Those 11 years taught Clara things no book had ever managed to, though she never entirely set aside the habits her father had given her. On slow winter evenings, long after the supper dishes were cleared, she would sometimes take out the old composing stick, just to feel its weight in her palm, arranging scraps of nothing in particular, a psalm, a line from a letter, once the whole of Scout's name spelled out in careful reverse type, just to make Thomas laugh, and Thomas, who could not himself read backward to save his life, took to calling her his little printer, with a fondness that never once sounded like teasing. Scout, for his part, grew into the sort of dog neighbors remembered by name, rather than description, the kind who walked the fence line each evening, as though counting the fence posts, who could be trusted around the youngest calves and the oldest hens alike, and who developed, over those years, an unshakable habit of positioning himself between Clara and any stranger who came too near too quickly, a habit Thomas used to joke was the dog's way of interviewing every visitor before he himself decided whether they could be trusted. It was a small, unremarkable happiness, the kind most people mistake for permanence, simply because it has never yet been tested, and Clara, in the years that followed, would think back on those winters with a tenderness sharpened rather than dulled by everything that came after. It was Thomas's sudden death, a fever that took him in 4 days, faster than anyone could credit, that opened the door through which everything else came pouring in. Clara was still hollow with grief, barely 3 days a widow, when Warren Whitfield arrived from the county seat with a document Clara had never seen, and a lawyer who spoke a great deal without once looking at her directly. The paper, dated 2 years prior, claimed that Thomas had quietly transferred the deed of the farm to his brother, in exchange for a debt Clara had never known existed, in expectation, the lawyer said delicately, of exactly this kind of misfortune. Clara asked to see her husband's signature beside the notary's seal, and found it thin, oddly slanted, nothing at all like the confident hand that had signed her marriage register, but grief had made her slow, and the county judge, an old crony of Warren's from card games at the Prairie Bend saloon, found the document sound. She had 11 days to vacate. Neighbors who had eaten at her table murmured sympathy, and did nothing further, because Warren Whitfield's brother-in-law happened to sit on the town council, and because in Prairie Bend, as in a great many small towns of that era, the currency of real consequence was not sympathy but standing, and Clara Whitfield, alone and freshly widowed, had none left to spend. She did not weep in front of Warren, though she wept plenty once the wagon was out of sight, sitting on an overturned bucket in the yard of a boarding house, with Scout's head heavy and warm in her lap, his one crooked ear twitching each time her breath caught. She had $41, a trunk of clothes, her father's old composing stick wrapped in a shawl at the bottom of her bag, and a dog who had not left her side in 11 years, and clearly did not intend to start now. She told herself, in the particular stubborn voice she had inherited from her father, that a woman who could set type backward in the dark could surely find some way forward in the daylight, though in the following 2 weeks that certainty was tested nearly to breaking, as she took in mending, scrubbed floors at the boarding house for her supper, and watched her $41 shrink toward nothing, while every door in Prairie Bend that might have offered honest work seemed, mysteriously, to close just before she reached it. She tried, in those first bewildering days, to fight the matter properly. She rode the 11 miles to the county seat herself, Scout riding uneasily beside her on the wagon bench, and sat for the better part of an afternoon, in a hallway outside the judge's chambers, waiting for an audience that, when it finally came, lasted scarcely 5 minutes. The judge, a heavy-set man with tobacco-stained fingers, who addressed her the entire time as Mrs. Whitfield, in a tone that made the courtesy sound like an accusation, informed her that a notarized deed carried a presumption of validity that a grieving widow's memory of her husband's handwriting simply could not overturn, and that pursuing the matter further would only cost her money she plainly did not have. Clara left that hallway understanding, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the law in Prairie Bend was not blind so much as it was selectively attentive, and that a woman with no standing, no money, and no husband to speak for her, would find every official door built to swing shut rather than open. It was a lesson she carried with her afterward like a stone in her pocket, heavy, but useful, because it meant that whatever she managed to build again, she intended to build it in a way that did not depend on anyone else's permission. The county courthouse held its quarterly tax auction on the second Saturday of March, a ritual by which properties abandoned or forfeited for unpaid taxes were sold from the courthouse steps to whoever would pay the debt owed on them, and Clara went that morning less because she believed she could buy anything, and more because the auctioneer's clerk had once been kind to her, and had let it slip that watching the auction cost nothing, which was, by then, precisely the sort of entertainment her budget allowed. Most of the lots were unremarkable: a burned-out smithy, 2/4 sections of poor bottomland, until the clerk read out, almost apologetically, the last item on the list. The old Coldwell Printshop, corner of Cedar and 3rd, 20 years of back taxes owed, opening bid $8. A ripple of low laughter went through the small crowd. An older farmer beside Clara muttered that nobody in Prairie Bend had set foot past that door since Ezra Coldwell disappeared, that the place was thought unlucky, cursed even, though nobody could say exactly what they were afraid of beyond the fact that a man had walked into that shop one September night in 1868 and simply never walked out again, leaving behind a locked door, a cold press, and a mystery the town had long since decided it preferred not to examine too closely. No one raised a hand. The auctioneer called the number twice, then a third time out of formality, and it was in that silence, the silence of an entire town having decided, for 20 years running, that something was better left alone, that Clara Whitfield heard herself say, $11, her own voice sounding strange and small in her ears. Scout, sitting neatly at her feet through the whole proceeding, rose the instant the gavel fell, as though he had been waiting for exactly that sound. The clerk handed her a rusted iron key nearly the length of her palm, and half of Prairie Bend seemed to find urgent business elsewhere, rather than watch her walk toward the shop to use it. She did not blame them. She had heard the same whispers they had, about strange lights, about a man who vanished without so much as a farewell note to the town he'd served faithfully as its printer for a dozen years. But $11 was $11, and a locked building, however unlucky its reputation, was at least a roof, and by the time Clara worked the stiff old lock free and pushed the warped door open on its groaning hinge, she had already decided she did not have the luxury of being afraid of ghosts when she had a much more immediate fear of hunger. Dust hung in the slanted afternoon light, like something suspended in amber. A great iron hand press stood in the center of the room, exactly as it had been left, its bed still holding the ghost-white impression of the last sheet it had ever printed. Typecases lining one wall in their small numbered drawers. And everywhere the particular, unmistakable smell that Clara had not breathed since her father's shop: linseed oil gone tacky with age, old paper, cold iron, a smell that struck her so suddenly and completely that she had to put a hand on the doorframe to steady herself. It was Scout who moved first. While Clara stood frozen in memory, the dog trotted directly past her, nose low, tail beginning to work back and forth with the particular seriousness he reserved for rabbit holes and thunderstorms, and went straight to the base of the great press, where he sat down, looked up at her, and gave one short, deliberate bark, as though announcing that he, at least, had already found something worth her attention. Clara might have dismissed it. A dog's nose finding a mouse nest was no great mystery, except that Scout did not leave. Over the following days, as Clara swept 20 years of dust from the floor, and scrubbed the grime from the windows to let in real light, Scout returned again and again to that same patch of floor beside the press's iron leg, scratching at the boards, whining low in his throat, refusing every attempt she made to call him elsewhere for more than a few minutes at a time. On the fourth evening, kneeling to see what so consumed him, Clara noticed for the first time that the floorboard beneath the press's left standard did not sit flush with its neighbors. A hair's difference, the kind only a woman who had spent her childhood reading tiny reversed letters would think to look at twice. She worked her fingers into the seam Scout had been pawing at for days, and felt, beneath a layer of packed grime, the unmistakable edge of a board cut deliberately shorter than the rest, fitted back into place by a careful hand that had wanted it to look, to any casual glance, like it belonged there. It took her the better part of an hour with a bent poker to work the board free, Scout pressed against her side the whole while, tail low and steady, watching the gap in the floor with an intensity that made the hair rise on Clara's arms. Beneath the board was a shallow cavity lined with oiled canvas, dry and undisturbed by 2 decades of dust, and inside it lay a bundle of papers bound with waxed twine, along with a small tin box and a single folded letter addressed, in a careful, familiar-looking printer's hand, to "Whoever finds this." Clara sat back on her heels in the fading light, with Scout's chin resting heavy on her knee, and for a long moment she simply held the bundle without opening it, aware in some instinctive way that whatever it contained had been hidden with enough care, and had waited long enough, that opening it would mean stepping into something far larger than the $11 purchase she had made 3 days before. The letter, when she finally unfolded it by lamplight, was written by Ezra Coldwell himself, and it did not read like the letter of a man planning to vanish for reasons of his own choosing. Coldwell wrote, in the plain, careful hand of a printer accustomed to making every word count, that he had discovered, through documents brought to him in confidence by a young surveyor's clerk troubled by his own conscience, that the tract of land on which half of Prairie Bend now stood, including the town well, the schoolhouse lot, and the commons where the 4th of July picnic was held every summer, had been platted 23 years earlier, as permanent public land, held in trust for the town's use forever, under the terms of the original county charter. Somewhere in the years since, that trust designation had been quietly erased from the recorded deed, and replaced with a private claim in the name of a young ambitious bank clerk named Silas Boone, the very man who had gone on to become Prairie Bend's most powerful citizen, its banker, and, for the past 9 years, its mayor. Coldwell had found the original, uncorrected survey plat, the one the county clerk's office had somehow misplaced from its own files, and he had set it in type, intending to print the truth in the next edition of his paper. The tin box held that original plat itself, brittle but legible, along with a notarized statement from the surveyor's clerk swearing to what he had seen. Coldwell's letter ended abruptly, the ink darker where his hand had pressed harder, as though he had written it in some haste. He had heard, he said, that men had been asking after him, and he did not entirely trust that he would live to see the story printed, and so he was hiding the proof where he trusted it would be safe until an honest hand found it, behind the press that had been, in his words, the only thing in this town that never once lied to me. Clara read the letter twice through, and then a third time, with Scout's steady breathing warm against her leg, the only sound in the shop besides the wind working at the window panes, and she understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with the March night outside, exactly why no one in Prairie Bend had wanted this building for 20 years. It was not superstition that had kept the town away from the old print shop. It was fear, planted deep, and tended carefully by a man with every reason to want Ezra Coldwell's disappearance to stay an unsolved mystery rather than an unfinished sentence. She spent the following days poring over the surveyor's statement, and the brittle plat itself, laying them flat beneath glass jars to keep them from curling further, tracing the faded pencil lines of the original township grid, until she understood them nearly as well as the man who had drawn them. The plat showed, in a hand grown thin with age, the commons marked not as private acreage, but as a shaded tract, labeled simply, Reserved, Public Trust, Township of Prairie Bend, and beside it, in a different and noticeably fresher ink, someone had once begun to trace over the boundary lines, as though testing how convincingly they might be redrawn. It was, Clara thought, a peculiar kind of crime. Not a robbery carried out in a single violent motion, but a slow, patient erasure. A truth removed one careful pen stroke at a time, until an entire town had forgotten it ever owned the ground beneath its own well. She found herself, more than once, running her thumb over Ezra Coldwell's careful, old-fashioned lettering, and feeling something she had not expected to feel for a stranger long dead. A fierce, protective kinship, as though the shop's silence for 20 years had been less a curse than a held breath, waiting for someone willing to finish what he had started. Scout, through all of it, kept his post beside the press as faithfully as he had once kept watch over the farm's fence line, rising each time Clara did, lying back down only once she had, as though he understood, in whatever way a dog understands such things, that the work she had taken up now mattered every bit as much as the work she had lost. Clara did not sleep that night, and by morning she had made a decision that frightened her nearly as much as the letter itself. She would not sell the papers, nor bury them again, nor quietly leave town with what little money the information might be worth to a man desperate to keep it buried. She would do the one thing Ezra Coldwell had never gotten the chance to do. She would set the type herself, run the press herself, and print the truth exactly as he had intended it, because a press, as her father had told her 100 times over 100 childhood evenings, did not lie. It only told you what you gave it, and Clara intended to give it everything Ezra Coldwell had died, or nearly died, trying to say. Word travels fast in a town the size of Prairie Bend, and it did not take more than a week of Clara scrubbing windows and hauling supplies for anyone to notice that the widow Whitfield was doing considerably more than sweeping out a dead man's shop, particularly once she began asking the county clerk, with careful, deliberate patience, to see the original land office survey records for the township. Silas Boone came to see her himself, on a gray Tuesday afternoon, dressed in the fine black coat that had become as much a part of Prairie Bend's landscape as the grain elevator, and he was, at first, all warm concern, telling her how unwise it was for a woman alone to take on a building with such an unfortunate history, offering, quite generously he said, to buy the property back from her for $30, nearly 3 times what she had paid. Clara thanked him and declined, and watched something small and cold move behind his eyes, before the pleasant mask settled back into place. Scout, who had greeted every other visitor to the shop with a wagging tail and an inquisitive nose, stood the entire length of Boone's visit, pressed against Clara's skirts, low growl caught somewhere in his throat, refusing to so much as sniff the mayor's outstretched hand. The pressure that followed was not crude, at first, because men like Boone rarely needed crudeness. It was simply a matter of doors closing, one after another, in the particular quiet way that power closes doors in a small town. The general store's owner, who had extended Clara a small line of credit for ink and paper, suddenly discovered he could extend it no further. A young man Clara had hired to help haul type cases found the offer of steady farmhand work elsewhere too good to refuse the same week she needed him most. Someone left a dead crow on the print shop's front step one morning, and though Clara told herself it was likely a superstitious neighbor, rather than any direct order from Boone, she noted that Scout would not go near the spot for 3 days afterward, circling it with hackles raised whenever they passed. Worse than any of it was the whisper campaign that began working its way through the church socials and the feed store, that the widow Whitfield had lost her wits along with her husband, that she was chasing the same foolish ghosts that had cost Ezra Coldwell his life, that decent people ought to steer clear of her and her business both. Clara felt the town's collective gaze turn wary and sideways whenever she walked its streets, and there were nights, alone in the small room behind the shop, with only Scout's steady warmth against her side, when she wondered whether she had traded one kind of homelessness for a far more dangerous one. It was Scout, in the end, who forced the matter to a head sooner than Clara had planned. Late one night, roughly 3 weeks into her work reconstructing Coldwell's intended article from his notes and the surveyor's sworn statement, Scout woke her with a low, continuous growl aimed at the shop's back door. Hackles raised the full length of his spine, and Clara had barely gotten out of bed before she heard the unmistakable scrape of a boot on the back step, and smelled, faint but unmistakable through the window crack, the sharp tang of coal oil. She threw open the door herself, rather than wait, Scout surging past her legs with a bark that could have woken the whole block, and caught in the lamplight the fleeing back of a man she did not recognize, a half-empty can of coal oil, abandoned on the step where he'd dropped it in his hurry to escape a dog, considerably more determined than he had bargained for. Clara stood in the doorway shaking, one hand pressed to Scout's heaving side, and understood with sudden clarity that Boone's patience, or perhaps his confidence that she would simply give up, had run out. She did not wait for the county sheriff, who she suspected, correctly, as it turned out, owed his position to Boone's backing, and would find some reason to dismiss a widow's account of a stranger on her step. Instead, Clara spent the next 4 nights barely sleeping, sitting tight by lamplight, with hands that ached by dawn, Scout dozing fitfully at her feet, but rising at every unfamiliar sound outside, until she had composed and locked a form containing Ezra Coldwell's original findings in full: the misplaced survey plat, the surveyor's clerk's sworn statement, and Coldwell's own words about the trust land, alongside her own account of how she had come to find them, and why, 20 years on, a man's disappearance and a town's stolen commons deserved finally to be spoken of honestly. She printed 300 copies on the very press Ezra Coldwell had left cold and waiting, running the crank herself through the small hours of the night, while Scout stood guard at the door, and by dawn, she had a stack of broadsheets, still faintly damp with fresh ink, and a plan that required every ounce of nerve she had left. She did not distribute the sheets quietly. On the morning of the town's spring market day, with Prairie Bend's Main Street more crowded than it had been in months, Clara Whitfield walked the length of Cedar Street with Scout trotting steady and alert at her heel, and a satchel of broadsheets over her shoulder, and she placed a copy in the hand of every person she passed: the storekeeper who had cut her credit, the churchwomen who had whispered behind their fans, the young men loitering outside the saloon, asking nothing of them except that they read it before they judged her further. Word moved through that crowd faster than Clara could walk its length, and by mid-morning, a genuine crowd had gathered outside the bank itself, broadsheets in hand, voices rising in the particular mixture of anger and vindication that comes when a community realizes it has been quietly cheated for 20 years by the very man who had told them, again and again, how much he had their interests at heart. Silas Boone emerged onto the bank's steps to find not the quiet, easily dismissed widow he had expected to intimidate into silence, but an entire town holding printed proof in their own hands, and Clara, standing at the base of those steps with Scout pressed close against her, watched the color drain from his face as he understood, in real time, exactly how thoroughly Ezra Coldwell's unfinished sentence had finally been completed. What followed took weeks rather than hours to fully resolve, but the shape of it was set in motion that very morning. The county land office, faced with a genuine notarized statement and a survey plat that matched records still held, Clara had made certain to check, in the territorial archive 2 counties over, was compelled to open a formal inquiry, and within it emerged not only confirmation of the trust land's original status, but a paper trail showing that Silas Boone had, 20 years earlier, paid the county recorder a substantial and entirely undocumented sum around the same time the deed's language had quietly changed. The recorder, an old man by then, broke under questioning, and confessed that Boone had also arranged for 2 men to discourage the town's printer from asking further questions, an arrangement that had gone considerably further than either the recorder or, he swore, even Boone himself had originally intended, and which had ended with Ezra Coldwell's death, not disappearance, but death, at the hands of men Boone had hired to silence him, his body long since hidden in a dry well on abandoned land outside town, discovered at last that same spring once the county finally had reason to look for it. Silas Boone was arrested within the month, stripped of his position as mayor by a town council no longer willing to protect him, now that the ground beneath him had, quite literally, been proven to belong to someone else, and the commons, the schoolhouse lot, and the town well were formally restored to Prairie Bend's public trust, exactly as the original charter had always intended. The town held a modest ceremony that June to mark the occasion, and, at the insistence of several of the very neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid her, to properly bury Ezra Coldwell beside his late wife, with his name cleared at last of the 20-year cloud of suspicion and rumor that had followed his memory. Clara did not seek reward from any of it, and it surprised her more than a little when the town council, in the same session that stripped Boone of his office, voted to formally recognize her ownership of the printshop free of any further claim, and to award her, from Boone's forfeited assets, a modest sum in recognition of what her diligence had returned to the town, enough, as it turned out, to properly stock the shop with fresh type and good paper, and to hire back the young man who had once been too frightened of Boone's influence to work for her. She reopened the Prairie Bend paper that autumn, under its old name, restored, with her father's composing stick set proudly on the counter, where anyone could see it, and Scout, whose nose had found what 20 years of fearful silence had buried, took up a permanent post on a folded blanket beside the very press where he had first sat down and refused to move. It occurred to Clara often, in the quiet hours of printing that followed, how closely her own story had come to mirror the one she had uncovered, how a thing dismissed as worthless, whether a widow with $41, or a locked shop nobody would touch, could hold within it a value that only patience, and honesty, and one loyal dog's stubborn nose, had been willing to look hard enough to find. She thought, too, of her father's old words about the press that never lied, and understood now that he had meant something larger than ink and type, that the truth, once set down honestly, has a way of waiting patiently, exactly where it was left, for someone brave enough, or simply desperate enough to come looking. Prairie Bend had spent 20 years walking past that shuttered building, certain there was nothing behind its door but bad luck and old grief, and it had taken a woman with nothing left to lose, and a dog who trusted his nose over the town's fear, to prove that overlooked things are very often not empty at all, only waiting. Thank you for spending this time with Clara and Scout, and the quiet corner of Kansas they called home. If their story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who still believes that ordinary people can set right what powerful men would rather keep buried, and we would love to know, what is the one overlooked thing in your own life you have never quite gotten around to opening up and looking at properly? Until next time, stay close.